before the name Big X echoed through the prison camps of Nazi Germany, before tunnels called Tom, Dick, and Harry were dug beneath frozen ground, there was just a man chasing the clouds, Roger Joyce Bushell. Born in 1910 in the wide sunlit plains of South Africa, Bushell's story began far from the chaos of war. The son of British parents, he grew up with a fierce sense of discipline and adventure. People who knew him said he was bold, confident, and unafraid of anything. From an early age, Roger seemed destined for the sky. When he moved to England to study law at Cambridge, he was already a pilot. The air called to him more than anything else. He joined the Royal Air Force, and his talent was undeniable. He became one of the finest Spitfire pilots in the RAF, sharp-minded, quick, and impossibly brave. But the world was darkening. In 1939, Europe was at war. Hitler's armies marched across nations, and the skies above France turned into battlefields of smoke and fire. Roger, now a squadron leader, led his men into combat with steady hands and fierce pride. On a cold morning in 1940, he took off from his base near Boulogne on a routine mission. The clouds above the French countryside looked calm, but the calm didn't last. Out of nowhere, German Messerschmitts appeared, fast, deadly, and hungry for blood. The air was torn apart by gunfire. Machine guns screamed, engines burned, and the blue sky turned to smoke. Roger's Spitfire was hit. Oil burst from the engine, flames licking the cockpit. He fought to keep control. His oxygen mask fogged, his heart pounding. The aircraft was dying. He had no choice. Roger pulled the canopy and jumped. The cold wind roared in his ears as he plummeted toward the fields below, parachutes snapping open just in time. He hit the ground hard, bruised and breathless, but alive. He barely had a moment to gather himself before he heard shouting. German voices growing closer. Soldiers surrounded him, rifles raised. The war had caught him. The sky he loved was gone, replaced by the cold, grey bars of captivity. The journey into imprisonment began with the rattling of train wheels. Roger and dozens of other Allied airmen were packed into cattle cars, shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with sweat and fear. Through the cracks in the wooden walls, he could see the countryside rolling by. Green fields, rivers, distant villages, all now under Nazi control. Inside, no one spoke. The silence was heavy. Everyone was thinking the same thing. Would they ever see home again? When the train finally stopped, the doors opened to a new kind of battlefield. One surrounded by barbed wire, wooden huts, and high towers. German guards barked orders, dogs growled, and the prisoners were lined up, counted, and tagged. This was Stalag Luft, a transit camp for captured airmen. Roger quickly realized that he was no ordinary prisoner. His mind refused to surrender. Even in chains, he began studying the camp, the guards' movements, the layout, the weaknesses. Every detail was a clue. Every moment an opportunity. To him, captivity wasn't an end. It was a challenge. From the very beginning, Bushell's mind worked like a strategist. He observed how the Germans behaved, how the routine of the camp created patterns that could be broken. The first chance he got, he tried to escape. With a few fellow officers, he slipped through the darkness, using forged passes and stolen tools. For a few days, freedom felt close. But the Gestapo was efficient. They caught him near the Swiss border. The escape had failed. The Germans were furious. They marked him as dangerous, a man too clever to be treated like the rest. From that day forward, Roger Bushell was considered a high-risk prisoner. He was transferred through a series of camps, each one harsher and more secure than the last. until finally he arrived at the place the Germans believed no one could ever escape from, Stalag Luft III. The camp was built deep in Poland, far from civilization, surrounded by thick pine forests and shifting sand. The Germans boasted that it was escape-proof. They designed the ground so that tunnels would collapse before reaching the outer fence. They built double rows of barbed wire, tall watchtowers, and armed guards who never looked away. To most men, it was hopeless. To Roger Bushell, it was the perfect challenge. He stepped through the gates and scanned the camp like a commander surveying a battlefield. Around him were hundreds of Allied airmen, British, Canadian, Australian, American, all stripped of freedom but not of spirit. Each one carried the same burning question: will we ever be free again? Bushell saw more than prisoners. He saw soldiers, skilled, intelligent men with courage still alive in their hearts. He gathered a few of the senior officers in secret. The room was dim, lit by a single candle, the air heavy with cigarette smoke. Roger leaned forward and spoke in a low voice. "It is the sworn duty of every officer to attempt to escape, not for ourselves, but for our countries. If we can make the Germans waste time hunting us, if we can keep their troops from fighting at the front, we help win this war." That was the moment it began. The Great Escape was no longer just an idea, it was a mission. Roger Bushell became known as Big X, the man in charge of every escape plan within Stalag Luft III. His confidence inspired everyone. The men trusted him, believed in him. Under his direction, the camp transformed from a prison into a hive of secret activity. Over 600 men were soon part of the organization. Every man had a role: diggers, forgers, tailors, carpenters, lookouts, and smugglers. The plan was bold beyond imagination. They would dig 3 tunnels, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, each one a potential route to freedom. The tunnels had to go deep, at least 30 feet underground to avoid detection. The diggers worked by candlelight, using bedboards as shovels and tin cans to carry out sand. The walls were reinforced with stolen wood. The air pumped in through handmade bellows built from bits of old uniforms and food tins. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and endless. But every scrape of a shovel was an act of rebellion. The sand they dug out couldn't be seen by guards, so they carried it in small pouches hidden inside their trousers. During roll calls, they walked around the yard, slowly shaking the sand out through holes in their pockets, letting it mix with the dirt. The technique became known as penguining, named after the odd waddle they had to do to hide the movement. Despite the risk, the men laughed, joked, and carried on. For the first time since being captured, they felt like soldiers again, fighting back in their own way. Bushell oversaw every part of the operation. He organized the workshops where prisoners forged identity papers, printed ration cards, and even built civilian clothes from scraps of blankets. Nothing escaped his notice. He knew the dangers. If the Germans discovered what they were doing, punishment would be brutal. But he also knew what was at stake. He told his men, quietly but firmly, "This isn't about running away. It's about defiance. It's about proving they can't cage us forever." As winter set in, snow covered the camp, and the guards grew suspicious. One of the tunnels, Tom, was eventually discovered. The Germans sealed it and increased security. For most, it was a crushing blow. But Bushell didn't flinch. He looked at the men and said, "Then we dig harder. We finish Harry." And they did. For months more, under freezing temperatures and constant fear, they dug deeper, longer, and faster. Every night, the sound of scraping echoed faintly through the ground, the heartbeat of a dream that refused to die. By early 1944, after more than a year of planning and digging, The tunnel named Harry was finally ready. The Great Escape was no longer just a plan. It was about to become one of the most daring acts of resistance the world had ever seen. March 24th, 1944. The air was bitter cold, the sky black with only a trace of moonlight. Inside the wooden huts of Stalag Luft III, hundreds of men waited in silence. They had spent more than a year planning this moment, and now it had arrived. Beneath the frozen earth, hidden below Hut 104, lay the tunnel they called Harry. Roger Bushell, the man everyone called Big X, stood near the entrance, his face calm, but his eyes burning with intensity. Around him, the chosen escapees gathered. Their breaths came out in short white clouds. Each man clutched a small pack, forged papers, maps, a few crumbs of food, and the desperate hope of freedom. Bushell spoke softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Remember," he said, "this isn't just for us. Every man who makes it out tonight gives them more to fear and more to fight." The first man dropped into the tunnel at 10 p.m. The hatch closed behind him, sealing them in darkness. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The tunnel was so narrow that the men had to crawl on their bellies, their shoulders scraping the walls. Candles flickered as they moved, casting trembling shadows on the wooden supports. Every few meters, the diggers had built small chambers, air holes, supply boxes, and stops for the men to rest. They were 30 feet below the surface, working in silence, pushing themselves forward inch by inch. The tunnel stretched for over 330 feet, carved through sand that could collapse at any moment. Above them, the camp slept under the watch of floodlights and machine guns. Guards in tall towers smoked their cigarettes and scanned the snowy forest beyond the fence. They had no idea that the ground beneath them was alive with movement. When the first man reached the end of the tunnel, he pushed up the small wooden hatch, expecting to emerge in the shelter of the trees. But when he looked through the hole, his heart sank. The tunnel had come up short. Instead of ending deep in the forest, it opened several meters before the tree line, in open ground, visible to the guards. A moment of dread spread through the tunnel. Some wanted to call it off, but Bushell refused. "We've come too far," he whispered. "We keep going." So they did. One by one, the men crawled through the tunnel, emerging into the freezing night. They waited for the guard's searchlight to swing away before sprinting across the open ground into the woods. It was slow, dangerous work. Each man took nearly 10 minutes to crawl, wait, and run. Inside the camp, the next group waited for the signal. A series of gentle tugs on a rope that told them the last man had cleared the exit. It was mechanical, methodical, almost military in its precision. The hours passed, the cold deepened, and still they went. By dawn, 76 men had escaped through the tunnel. The 77th was halfway through, when a guard noticed movement near the fence. A shout pierced the air, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. The alarm sounded, sirens wailing through the camp. Searchlights swung wildly, sweeping the snow. Dogs barked, soldiers yelled, gunfire echoed through the forest. Inside the huts, men who hadn't yet escaped froze in place as German boots thundered outside. Guards stormed through the camp, kicking in doors, shouting in fury. The Great Escape had begun, and ended. For the 76 men outside the wire, freedom was fleeting. They scattered in all directions, some heading north toward Denmark, others west toward France, and a few east toward Poland. Many carried maps, compasses, and forged papers that had been carefully crafted in the camp's secret workshops. But they were hunted men now. Roger Bushell and his companion, French pilot Bernard Scheidhauer, set out together. They wore civilian coats and carried false identification as businessmen. Their plan was to reach Czechoslovakia, then make their way through neutral territory to freedom. For a while, it seemed to work. They boarded trains, changed routes, and passed through towns under the noses of German soldiers. But across the Reich, the Gestapo was already mobilizing. Roadblocks went up. Posters with descriptions of the fugitives appeared in every town. Hitler's fury was absolute. He was humiliated that so many Allied officers had slipped through his guards, and he demanded a response so brutal it would terrify every prisoner in Germany. More than 5,000 soldiers, police, and civilians joined the hunt. Planes scouted from above, dogs tracked through forests, and patrols checked every road and railway station. The entire country became a net tightening around the escapees. Bushell and Scheidhauer made it as far as the city of Saarbrücken. They boarded another train, but this time their luck ran out. A Gestapo officer noticed their accents and demanded papers. Scheidhauer's documents looked suspicious. The officer ordered them off the train. Within hours, they were in custody. The interrogation was harsh. The Gestapo knew Bushell was no ordinary prisoner. They had heard of Big X, the man who masterminded the escapes. They beat him, starved him, tried to break him, but he said nothing, not a single name. For 3 days, they kept him in a small, cold cell. Then, on March 29th, 1944, the guards came for him and Scheidhauer. They were driven out of the city in a black car. The road was empty, lined with pine trees, the sky grey and heavy with cloud. The car stopped in a clearing. The men were told to get out. A moment later, 2 shots rang out. Roger Bushell was 33 years old. He had given everything, not just his freedom, but his life, to prove that even inside the most secure prison, courage could still breathe. When news of the murders reached Stalag Luft III, silence fell across the camp. Men who had once whispered with excitement now stared at the ground, grief cutting deeper than any fence. 50 of their brothers, including Bushell, had been executed. Only 3 of the 76 who escaped would make it home alive. The Germans tried to erase the story, but they couldn't. Word spread through the Allied forces of the tunnels, the courage, the defiance. Roger Bushell became more than a man. He became a symbol. The others called him the soul of the escape, the man who taught them that captivity could never kill the will to fight. When the war ended a year later, Allied investigators hunted down those responsible for the executions. The search took years. One by one, the Gestapo officers who carried out the killings were found, tried, and punished. Some were executed, others imprisoned. Justice, though slow, did not forget. Stalag Luft III was liberated in 1945. The huts were empty, the tunnels collapsed, but the spirit of those who had once lived there remained. In the years that followed, books were written and films were made. The world learned the story of the Great Escape, of the men who dug with spoons and dreams, who risked everything for a taste of freedom. At the heart of it all was Roger Bushell, the man who led them. He never saw the victory he helped build. He never felt the warmth of freedom again. But his legacy lived on in every pilot who flew for liberty, in every prisoner who refused to bow to tyranny. In Żagań, Poland, where Stalag Luft III once stood, there is a memorial. Among the 50 names carved into stone is one that stands for them all. Squadron Leader Roger Joyce Bushell, Royal Air Force. The pine trees still whisper above that ground. The air is still, the earth quiet. But beneath it lies the memory of men who dug toward freedom, and the man who led them into history. After the guns had fallen silent and Europe began to rebuild, the story of the Great Escape did not end with the graves of the 50 men. It began again, in whispers, in investigations, and in the hearts of those who survived. Stalag Luft III lay in ruins when Allied forces arrived. The huts stood abandoned, the fences broken, the guard towers empty. What had once been a fortress of control now felt like a ghost town, but inside the dust and silence were traces of something unbreakable. A map carved into wood, scraps of forged papers, broken shovels, and the remains of tunnels that had once carried men toward hope. The surviving prisoners, those who had watched from inside as the alarms sounded that fateful night, struggled to understand the cost of what had happened. For many of them, Bushell wasn't just a commander. He was their reason to keep believing that even behind barbed wire, they were still soldiers, still free in spirit. One man, Wing Commander Herbert Massey, had known Bushell well. He had approved the escape, even though he doubted its chances. When the Gestapo murders were confirmed, Massey felt it as a personal loss. In a post-war interview, he said softly, "Roger gave us back our pride. Even in defeat, he made us believe we were still fighting the war." The Allies were determined to find out what had really happened to Bushell and the others. The task fell to the Royal Air Force's Special Investigation Branch, men who had seen war but now faced a different kind of battlefield, a Europe in ruins, scattered with secrets. They began with names, towns, reports from witnesses who remembered seeing prisoners being taken away by the Gestapo. Slowly, piece by piece, the investigators followed the trail. It led through Germany, Austria, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, a map of shadows, lined with fear and silence. Many of the former Gestapo officers had gone into hiding. Some had assumed new identities. Others had joined civilian life, pretending that the past had vanished with the fall of the Reich. But justice had patience. One of the lead investigators, squadron leader Frank McKenna, made it his mission to bring every murderer to trial. He carried with him the photographs of the 50 men, their faces young, brave, unaware of their fate. When he spoke to witnesses, he would lay those photos on the table and say, "Tell me what you saw. Tell me who did this." It took years. Some suspects were captured in British-occupied Germany. Others were found by the Americans or the Soviets. The process was long, complex, and often dangerous. But by 1948, 21 of the Gestapo men responsible for the executions had been tried at the British military court in Hamburg. During the trial, the details of the murders were laid bare. Orders had come directly from Hitler himself. He wanted every captured officer shot, not as soldiers, but as examples. It was one of the clearest violations of the Geneva Convention in the war. When the verdicts were read, several of the accused were sentenced to death. Others received long prison terms. For the families of the murdered airmen, it was a small measure of peace, but peace nonetheless. For years after, the survivors of Stalag Luft III carried the memory of those nights within them. Every reunion, every letter, every story told around a fire carried the same ghost, the sound of digging beneath the earth, the scrape of tin cans against sand, the whisper of Bushell's voice saying, "It's not just about escape, it's about defiance." Roger Bushell's story became a symbol not only for the RAF, but for all who had suffered in captivity. In 1950, a memorial was built near the site of the old camp in Żagań, Poland. It stands in a quiet forest clearing, surrounded by pine trees, the same trees that once hid the tunnel exit. The stone bears the names of all 50 men, but at its centre, carved deeper than the rest, is Bushell's. Every year, British and Allied airmen visit that place. They bring wreaths, small flags and letters. Some stand in silence, others whisper a prayer. They say it feels as if time itself stops there, as if the forest still remembers. In 1963, Hollywood brought The Great Escape to the world. The film captured the imagination of millions, the daring plan, the spirit of defiance, the cost of freedom. But for those who had lived it, the movie was more than entertainment. It was memory, turned to sound and light. Though many details were fictionalized, the heart of it, the courage, the leadership, the sacrifice, was real. The character played by Richard Attenborough was based on Roger Bushell, and those who knew him said the performance captured something true. The quiet authority, the steady fire in his eyes, the belief that courage was not about surviving, but standing tall even when you know you might not. In the years that followed, Bushell's name appeared in RAF training halls, in books, and in lectures given to young pilots. He became a lesson, not just in escape, but in leadership. His fellow prisoners often said he never asked others to do what he wouldn't do himself. He took the same risks, faced the same punishments, and held the same fear, though he never showed it. Today, his story still reaches across generations. In classrooms and military academies, students learn about the Great Escape, not only as a piece of history, but as a symbol of resilience, the idea that the human spirit, even caged, will always find a way to rise. But there is something quieter, something deeper, that history books often miss. It is the moment in the tunnel when a man's hands tremble as he digs through frozen sand. The moment when the rope tugs once, twice, and he knows it's time to crawl toward freedom. The heartbeat in the dark, the fear, the hope, the whisper that says, "Go." Those moments, invisible, unrecorded, are where Roger Bushell truly lives. Not just in the escape, but in the will that made it possible. In the end, the story of Roger Bushell is not one of tragedy, but of triumph. Not of death, but of defiance. For even when he fell, he did so standing for something larger than himself. And that, perhaps, is the greatest escape of all. The escape from fear, from silence, from surrender. Even after the war had ended, the echoes of Stalag Luft III and the Great Escape continued to reverberate across Europe. The men who survived returned to lives forever changed. Many carried invisible scars. The memories of the men who didn't make it, the harshness of captivity, and the haunting image of barbed wire cutting through the horizon. Roger Bushell's name, however, became larger than life. In the months following Germany's surrender, Allied officers and investigators worked tirelessly to document what had happened in the camp and to track down those responsible for the murders of 50 of the escapees. It was painstaking work. Every witness had to be found, every detail verified. Some witnesses had seen the executions, others had heard the orders whispered in fear. Piece by piece, the truth emerged. The trials that followed became an essential chapter in post-war justice. Gestapo officers were tried in Hamburg, and some were executed for their crimes. The world watched as the events of March 1944 were recounted in meticulous detail. It was a reminder that tyranny, even at its most ruthless, could not escape accountability. Meanwhile, the survivors of Stalag Luft III shared their stories in letters, in interviews, and eventually in books. They spoke of Bushell not just as a planner or a leader, but as a man whose courage inspired hundreds of others to act when fear might have otherwise frozen them. He had created a spark of hope that no prison could extinguish. The Great Escape was immortalized in popular culture, most famously in the 1963 film, which captured the audacity, tension, and heroism of that March night. While some details were dramatized for the screen, the essence of the story, Bushell's leadership, the meticulous planning, and the courage of ordinary men defying impossible odds, remained intact. The film introduced millions to the spirit of defiance that had thrived in a POW camp thousands of miles from home. Yet beyond the films and books, there was a quieter, deeper legacy. In Żargan, Poland, a memorial stands in the forest near where Stalag Luft III once held the Allied airmen. It is a simple stone, etched with the names of the 50 men who were executed. Among them is Roger Bushell, whose courage and sacrifice are remembered not only by his fellow airmen, but by every visitor who stands in solemn reflection. Each year, veterans and families of the fallen gather there. Wreaths are laid, flags are raised, and stories are recounted in hushed voices. The memorial is more than stone and metal. It is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. Even decades later, the bravery of Bushell and his comrades resonates with anyone who believes that courage can survive even the darkest oppression. Bushell's influence extended beyond commemoration. His planning and leadership became a case study for military officers around the world. His insistence on organization, careful coordination, and moral responsibility inspired new generations of soldiers, pilots, and strategists. His approach to leadership under extreme pressure became a model. To lead is not merely to command, but to inspire hope, to instill resilience, and to act with integrity even when the stakes are life and death. Stories of those who attempted the escape, those who survived, and those who did not, were preserved with reverence. Former prisoners recounted tales of frozen nights digging tunnels by candlelight, of whispered instructions, and of the camaraderie that carried them through hunger, fear, and despair. Each account painted Bushell as the anchor of morale, the steady hand in chaos, and the man who reminded them all that freedom was worth any cost. The legacy of the Great Escape also served as a moral touchstone. It demonstrated that acts of courage and resistance, even when they do not succeed in the immediate sense, carry profound significance. Bushell's determination to challenge the captors, to organize a massive escape operation, and to lead by example showed that the human spirit is capable of extraordinary resilience. In classrooms, in books, and in lectures, Bushell's story became more than a tale of war. It became a lesson in leadership, ethics, and hope. It reminded young soldiers and civilians alike that even in situations designed to crush the human will, courage can create meaning, unity, and lasting impact. And yet, perhaps the most important legacy is the quiet one, the one that cannot be quantified in memorials or film adaptations. It is in the subtle, invisible moments, the glance of determination between comrades in a dark tunnel, the soft encouragement whispered before a dangerous step, the unyielding belief that freedom is worth the cost of fear. That is the legacy Roger Bushell left behind. The knowledge that one person, acting with courage and vision, can ignite hope in hundreds, perhaps thousands, and shape the world in ways that survive long after the final shot is fired. Today, when visitors walk the pine-scented paths of Żargan, they hear more than wind through the trees. They hear echoes of whispered courage, the scrape of shovels in the night, and the quiet, enduring message of a man who refused to surrender. Roger Bushell did not live to see the end of the war, but in every account, every memorial, and every retelling, he lives on.